There is a question that scientists have been quietly wrestling with for decades. A question that seems simple on the surface but opens into something vast and disorienting the moment you start to follow it seriously. The question is this: were we ever alone? Not in the cosmic sense, not the telescope and radio signal version of the question that keeps astronomers up at night. In the most immediate, personal, earthly sense. Were we, Homo sapiens, the only kind of human being on this planet? Did we always have this world to ourselves? Or did we once share it with others, with beings who walked upright, who made fire and tools and sheltered their children against the cold, who looked up at the same stars, who mourned their dead, who were, in some fundamental sense that we struggle to define, human, but not us? The answer, confirmed now beyond serious scientific dispute by decades of fossil work and a revolution in ancient genetics, is that we were not alone, not even close. For most of the time that creatures we would recognize as human have walked this earth, there were multiple kinds of them, distinct species or populations or lineages, depending on how you want to categorize them, living across different regions of the globe, sometimes overlapping in territory, sometimes meeting, sometimes, as we will discover, doing far more than merely meeting. There were beings with different faces and different skulls and different cognitive styles and different histories of millions of years on this planet. And they were here when our ancestors arrived, and they shared the world with us for thousands of years. And then they were gone. The disappearance of these other human beings is one of the great unsolved mysteries of our species' story. Were they absorbed into our populations through interbreeding? Did disease introduced by the newcomers obliterate them silently and quickly? Did direct conflict push them out of territory after territory until there was nowhere left to go? Did they simply lose the ecological competition for resources, slowly fading as their numbers dwindled across centuries nobody recorded? The truth is that we do not know with certainty, and the uncertainty itself is haunting, because whatever happened, it happened, and we are the result of it, the sole survivors of what was once a far more diverse human family tree. Tonight, we are going to try to understand who those others were. We are going to try to bring them out of the darkness of deep time and into something like the light, to see them not as curiosities in a museum case or technical terms in a paleoanthropology paper, but as beings who were genuinely here, who had genuine lives, who navigated the same world we navigate with the same fundamental architecture of a human mind, and whose disappearance from the earth deserves to be understood and, perhaps, mourned. This is a story that goes back hundreds of thousands of years and touches every person alive today, in ways that are encoded not metaphorically, but literally in your DNA. It is one of the most extraordinary stories there is, and almost nobody knows it properly. Pull the covers up. Let the world outside go quiet. We are going to the deep past tonight, to the world before this world, when there was more than one kind of us. To understand the forgotten species that once shared the earth with our ancestors, you first have to let go of a picture of human evolution that most of us absorbed without quite realizing it. A picture so pervasive and so simplified that it distorts everything it touches. It is the picture of evolution as a ladder, a single straight line climbing from the primitive to the advanced, from the stooped and dim to the upright and brilliant, from the animal to the human, with each step replacing the last, and each newer form being simply better than what came before. In this picture, there is always only one kind of human at any given time, because the old kind is always replaced by the new kind, and the new kind is always us. This picture is wrong. It was wrong when it was first popularized in the 19th century, and it is wrong now. And the wrongness is not a minor correction of details, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how evolution actually works. Evolution does not produce a single advancing line. It produces a branching tree, with populations diverging from each other over time as they adapt to different environments and accumulate different genetic changes, with some branches flourishing and some going extinct and some persisting for millions of years in ecological niches that barely change. The human lineage is a tree, not a ladder, and for most of its history, that tree has had multiple living branches simultaneously. The earliest members of the genus Homo, the group that includes our own species and its close relatives, appear in the fossil record roughly 2.5 million years ago in Africa. From the beginning, there were multiple species. Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis were contemporaries in Africa around 2 million years ago, distinct enough that most researchers consider them separate species, similar enough that identifying individual fossils is sometimes genuinely difficult. By 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus had appeared and begun to spread out of Africa into Asia, and this species would persist for nearly 2 million years, an almost incomprehensible span of time before finally disappearing. Meanwhile, other forms were evolving in Africa, and eventually what we call archaic Homo sapiens, the ancestors of both modern humans and Neanderthals, was present across a broad range of territory. The crucial period for our story, the period when the multiple kinds of human beings were most clearly sharing the Earth, runs roughly from 300,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago, a span of 250,000 years. During this period, anatomically modern humans like ourselves had emerged in Africa. Neanderthals were firmly established across Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans, a population that remained completely unknown to science until 2010, ranged across vast stretches of Asia. Homo floresiensis, the tiny people of the Indonesian island of Flores, who stood roughly a metre tall, were present in Southeast Asia. Homo luzonensis had recently been identified in the Philippines, and quite possibly other populations and species existed that we have not yet found, or whose remains are too degraded to identify with confidence. This was a world of human diversity that we have no parallel for in any subsequent period. It was, in the most literal sense, a world with more than one kind of human being walking through it. What would it have felt like to live in that world? What would it have meant to be one of those beings, going about the business of survival, and to encounter one of the others? We cannot know exactly, but we know it happened, because the evidence that it happened is written in our genes, in the genes of everyone alive today, and that evidence has been one of the most startling scientific discoveries of the past 20 years. No human species in the history of our understanding of ourselves has been more comprehensively misrepresented than the Neanderthals, and no reversal of a scientific misconception has been more dramatic than the one that has taken place over the past 3 decades regarding who and what they actually were. The caricature of the Neanderthal, still surprisingly persistent in popular culture, despite everything researchers have learned, is of a hulking, slope-browed, dull-witted, quasi-human, a kind of evolutionary also-ran who lingered on the edges of the story until the truly intelligent modern humans arrived and swept them away. This caricature is wrong in almost every important particular, and understanding how wrong it is begins with understanding what the actual evidence shows. Begin with the brain. Neanderthal brains were, on average, larger than ours, not smaller, not roughly equal, larger by a measurable margin. The structure of the brain was different in certain ways, with a somewhat different organization of the frontal and occipital regions, but the overall volume exceeded that of most modern humans. This does not mean Neanderthals were necessarily more intelligent in any straightforward sense, because brain size is a very imperfect proxy for cognitive capacity. But it does mean that anyone who dismisses them as cognitively primitive, based on brain size, is arguing from evidence that cuts entirely the wrong way. Neanderthal skulls also contain all the anatomical structures required for complex speech, including a hyoid bone, the small floating bone in the throat that anchors the muscles of speech and swallowing, shaped in essentially the same way as in modern humans. The inference that they had language of significant complexity is not merely possible. It is the most parsimonious interpretation of the evidence. Now consider what they built and made. Neanderthal stone technology, known as the Mousterian tool tradition, was not the crude rock-banging of a barely sapient hominid. It was a sophisticated, multi-step reduction technology that required planning forward through a sequence of controlled strikes to produce specific flake shapes, understanding the fracture properties of different stone types, and exploiting them deliberately, and maintaining the cognitive representation of an end goal across multiple distinct actions spread over time. These are not simple behaviors. They require working memory, planning, and the kind of means-ends reasoning that is among the most distinctively sophisticated cognitive abilities of our own species. Neanderthals did this as a matter of course, producing tools of real functional excellence adapted to the specific tasks they needed to perform. They also produced hafted tools, attaching stone points to wooden handles using adhesives that they manufactured through a multi-step process involving birch bark tar. Producing birch bark tar requires controlling the temperature of a fire within a relatively precise range, because too cold and the process doesn't work, too hot and the tar degrades. Some researchers have demonstrated that this requires a mental model of the process that goes substantially beyond simple stimulus-response learning. Neanderthals did this. They also used ochre and manganese dioxide as pigments, almost certainly for body decoration or the decoration of objects. They made personal ornaments from eagle talons and shells. They made structured hearths with evidence of fire management. They buried their dead. The burial question has been debated with considerable intensity, because establishing intentionality in ancient burials is genuinely difficult, and the evidence for some proposed Neanderthal burials is contested. But the case for deliberate Neanderthal burial at multiple sites is strong enough that most researchers who have examined the evidence directly accept it. And deliberate burial implies a relationship with death that goes far beyond the purely biological, implies something that we might honestly, if cautiously, call a spiritual or symbolic dimension to their lives. People who bury their dead are not merely making a disposal decision. They are acknowledging that the person who died had a significance that continues past the moment of death, that the ending of a life is an event that demands ritual acknowledgement. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia for at least 300,000 years before modern humans arrived. 300,000 years. Put that in perspective. Modern human civilization in the form of cities and writing is roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years old. Neanderthals occupied Europe for 50 times that length of time, surviving through multiple glacial cycles that repeatedly transformed the landscape from rich forests to frigid tundra and back, adapting to each transformation, maintaining their populations, developing their technologies, building their cultures. They were not a failed experiment or a primitive precursor. They were a successful, cognitively sophisticated human population with a 300,000-year history on the continent they occupied, and then modern humans arrived. In 2010, scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a paper that announced the existence of a previously completely unknown human population, one that had never appeared in any history book, any mythology, any oral tradition that researchers had connected to them. This population had not been discovered through new fossil finds. It had been discovered through a fragment of a finger bone, a piece of bone so small it could fit in the palm of your hand, found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. From this tiny fragment, the Max Planck team had extracted ancient DNA and sequenced it, and what they found was neither Homo sapiens nor Neanderthal. It was something else. They called the population the Denisovans, after Denisova Cave where the fragment was found, and with that naming, the human family tree gained a new branch that had been entirely invisible to science until the moment of its discovery. The strangeness of the Denisovan story begins with how little physical evidence we have for them, and how much we know about them anyway, because what we know through genetics rather than through bones. The total physical Denisovan remains discovered to date amount to fragments of perhaps 4 individuals: the original finger bone, 2 molars of unusual size, a fragment of lower jaw, a possible fragment of skull, and a few other pieces. If you gathered all of it together, it would barely fill a small bowl. From this almost nothing in the physical sense, we know that the Denisovans existed, that they ranged across a vast geographic area from Siberia to Southeast Asia, that they persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, that they interbred with both modern humans and Neanderthals, and that their genetic legacy survives today in populations across a wide swath of Asia and the Pacific. How do we know all this without the bones to show for it? Because the genetics is extraordinarily powerful. When a population leaves genetic descendants, those descendants carry traces of that population in their DNA, and modern statistical methods can detect those traces and extract remarkable quantities of information from them. The genes of living people in Papua New Guinea, in Aboriginal Australia, in the Philippines, and across island Southeast Asia carry Denisovan sequences that make up several % of their total genomes in some cases. These sequences are not random noise. They have specific patterns that tell researchers something about the nature of the interbreeding events that produced them and about the populations involved. And those sequences make clear that the Denisovans were a real and distinct population of significant antiquity, genetically as different from both modern humans and from Neanderthals as the latter two were from each other. What did the Denisovans look like? The honest answer is that we barely know, because we have so few bones. The molars that have been found are notably large, larger than typical modern human molars, and different in their crown morphology from Neanderthal teeth, suggesting a distinctive anatomy. Recent work on ancient proteins extracted from a partial jawbone found in Tibet has confirmed Denisovan identity for that specimen and provided some additional clues about anatomy, but the reconstruction of what a Denisovan actually looked like in life remains deeply uncertain. They lived in environments ranging from the cold mountains of Siberia to, apparently, tropical Southeast Asia, which implies a degree of physical and cultural adaptability that is in itself impressive. The Tibetan jawbone came from the Baishia Karst cave on the Tibetan plateau at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters, an environment that presents serious challenges for human physiology. Denisovans were apparently among the first human beings to live at high altitude, and some of the genetic variants that allow modern Tibetan people to live and thrive at altitude without suffering the acute mountain sickness that affects most lowland-adapted humans have been identified as Denisovan in origin, incorporated into the Tibetan gene pool through ancient interbreeding, and then maintained by natural selection because of their survival value at altitude. The Denisovans did not merely disappear. They contributed something specific and physiologically important to the people who live in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Denisovan discovery changed something fundamental about how we understand human prehistory, and that change has not yet been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of who we are. Before 2010, the story of human origins was complicated but had a certain shape to it. Modern humans evolved in Africa, Neanderthals evolved in Europe, and the two met, and the Neanderthals ended up extinct. The Denisovans blew up the shape of the story entirely. Here was a third major human lineage, previously entirely unknown, that had occupied a vast stretch of the Earth's most populous continent for an enormous span of time, that had interbred with our ancestors and left their genes in the living descendants of those encounters, and whose existence we had not even suspected until a tiny piece of finger bone happened to be excavated from a cave in Siberia, and happened to contain enough intact ancient DNA to be sequenced. It raises an obvious and deeply unsettling question. How many other such populations were there? How many other branches of the human tree existed during the period when our ancestors were spreading across the world, leaving their genetic marks in the gene pools of the populations they encountered, and then disappearing? And how many of those populations are we still missing because their remains have not been found, or have been found but not recognized, or have dissolved beyond recovery in soils too acidic or too wet to preserve ancient DNA? In 2003, a team of archaeologists excavating in a cave called Liang Bua on the Indonesian island of Flores made a discovery that briefly upended everything researchers thought they knew about the last chapter of human evolution in Southeast Asia. And that continues to generate controversy and fascination in roughly equal measure. In the cave's sediments, the team found the remains of a human being unlike any previously described. The individual was an adult female, as evidenced by the development of her teeth and the fusion of her bones, but she stood roughly a meter tall, less than 3.5 feet, and had a brain volume of only about 400 cubic centimeters, roughly a third of the volume of a modern human brain, and comparable to the volume of a chimpanzee brain. The team named the species Homo floresiensis, but they almost immediately acquired a nickname that has stuck in popular culture ever since. They were called the Hobbits, and the comparison to Tolkien's fictional diminutive people was not entirely inappropriate, because the discovery seemed as improbable as fiction. What made Homo floresiensis so extraordinary was not merely their small size and small brains, but the combination of those features with the evidence that they were making and using sophisticated stone tools, were hunting large prey, including a dwarf elephant-like animal called a stegodon, and, in their early layers, may have been using fire. A small brain in conventional paleoanthropological thinking should mean a less cognitively capable organism. The small-brained hominids that preceded Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis in the fossil record were generally less technologically sophisticated, not more. But Homo floresiensis appeared to be an exception, a species with a brain far smaller than any other tool-making human ever documented, producing a tool technology that was genuinely complex and apparently effective. The explanation that most researchers now favor is island dwarfism, a well-documented evolutionary phenomenon in which populations of large mammals isolated on islands, where resources are limited, but predation pressure may also be reduced, evolve over time towards smaller body sizes because smaller individuals require less food to survive and reproduce. The ancestor of Homo floresiensis was almost certainly a larger-bodied hominid, possibly Homo erectus, who arrived on Flores before the island was fully isolated, and then evolved over hundreds of thousands of years toward the diminutive form that was found in Liang Bua. The brain, in this scenario, shrank along with the body but retained, perhaps through a process of internal reorganization, a cognitive capacity that was disproportionate to its size, allowing Homo floresiensis to maintain and use complex behaviors despite a brain that looks, by size alone, inadequate to support them. The dates of Homo floresiensis are another extraordinary aspect of their story. The most recent specimens found in Liangbua are dated to roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, which means that Homo floresiensis was alive and present on Flores at the time when modern humans were spreading through Southeast Asia and beginning to colonize Australia. Whether modern humans and Homo floresiensis ever met is unknown. But if modern humans were moving through the region during the period when Homo floresiensis was still alive, the probability that they encountered each other at least occasionally seems high. What those encounters were like, whether peaceful or violent or simply parallel lives with minimal contact, is completely beyond our current knowledge. Homo floresiensis disappears from the fossil record at roughly the same time that modern humans are likely to have been in the region, and the coincidence is suggestive even if it proves nothing. Local folklore on Flores includes stories of a small, hairy people called the Ibu Gogo, who were said to steal food, speak in a language that sounded like muttering, and who were eventually driven away by the village people sometime in the historical past, possibly as recently as a few centuries ago. Some researchers have speculated that these stories might preserve a cultural memory of actual encounters with Homo floresiensis, transmitted across generations after the last individuals died. The speculation is unprovable, but the fact that it is even plausible speaks to something important. The timeline for human coexistence with other human species is much more recent than most people realize, and the distance between us and those other beings may be much smaller than the comfortable gap we imagine. Of all the remarkable scientific developments of the past 2 decades, the one that has most profoundly changed our understanding of the relationship between modern humans and the other human species that once shared the Earth with us is the development of ancient DNA analysis, the ability to extract, sequence, and interpret genetic material from bones and teeth many tens of thousands of years old. This technology, largely pioneered by Svante Pääbo and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute and recognized with a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, has done something extraordinary. It has revealed that what we thought was a story of replacement was actually, at least in part, a story of merger. When modern humans spread out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans in Asia, the encounters were not always or even primarily violent eliminations of one population by another. They were, at least sometimes, and apparently with some regularity, physical encounters of the most intimate kind. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. The evidence is in the genomes of all non-African modern humans alive today, who carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA on average. This is not a marginal finding, not a statistical artifact, not an interpretation that depends on a particular way of looking at the data. It is one of the most robustly established findings in the entire history of human genetics. If you are of non-African ancestry, roughly 1% to 4% of your genome was last shared with the Neanderthal lineage rather than with the modern human lineage. Neanderthal DNA is in you. It is doing things. It is not inert. Modern humans also interbred with Denisovans. The evidence here is similarly clear, though the pattern is somewhat different. Populations in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry roughly 4% to 6% Denisovan ancestry in their genomes. Some populations in the Philippines carry even higher fractions. East Asians carry a small but detectable amount. The Denisovan contribution to the living human gene pool is real and documented and varies in interesting ways across populations, suggesting that there were multiple distinct interbreeding events between modern humans and different Denisovan populations at different times and places. And there is even more. Analysis of the Neanderthal genome itself reveals that Neanderthals, too, carry DNA from an earlier encounter with modern humans that preceded the main dispersal of our species from Africa, an encounter that apparently happened somewhere around 100,000 years ago, and that left traces in Neanderthal genomes. This finding, which suggests that the boundary between modern humans and Neanderthals was porous not just in one direction, but in both, and not just once but multiple times, completely changes the picture of what the relationship between these populations was like. They were not two separate evolutionary projects whose paths crossed briefly at the moment of modern human expansion. They were interacting populations with a long and complicated history of contact, gene flow, and genetic mixing that goes back far earlier than the period we usually focus on. What are the Neanderthal and Denisovan genes actually doing in modern human genomes? This question has attracted enormous research attention, and the answers are beginning to come in. Some of the introgressed sequences, as researchers call the DNA segments that entered our gene pool through ancient interbreeding, appear to be genuinely beneficial to the people who carry them. The Tibetan altitude adaptation mentioned earlier is one clear case. In addition, researchers have found that Neanderthal variants affect immune function, skin and hair characteristics, pain sensitivity, blood clotting, and a range of metabolic processes, among other things. Some of these effects appear to have been advantageous when our ancestors moved into environments that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years, environments with specific pathogen landscapes and specific ecological demands that Neanderthal genomes had been shaped by long experience to handle efficiently. By acquiring some of those Neanderthal variants, modern humans may have accelerated their own adaptation to new environments, picking up in a single generation what might otherwise have required thousands of years of natural selection to produce independently. This reframes the entire story of what happened when modern humans and other human species met. It was not simply conquest and replacement. It was, at least in part, a biological negotiation, an exchange of genetic information between populations that resulted in the modern human genome being enriched with variants that had been tested and refined by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in environments very different from the African savannas where modern humans originated. The Neanderthals and Denisovans are not simply gone. They are, in a meaningful biological sense, partially present in every non-African person alive today. Here is the question that haunts every honest account of the relationship between modern humans and the other human species they encountered. What happened to make the others disappear? It is a question that has no clean answer, and the uncertainty is not merely a product of insufficient evidence, though evidence is certainly limited. It reflects a genuine complexity in what happened, a complexity that resists the simple narrative of either peaceful absorption or violent elimination that people often want to apply. The timeline of Neanderthal disappearance is instructive and troubling. Neanderthals appear in the fossil record from roughly 300,000 years ago in Europe and Western Asia. Modern humans begin entering Europe around 45 to 42,000 years ago. Within a few thousand years, Neanderthals are gone. The speed of the overlap and the timing of the disappearance have led many researchers to conclude that the arrival of modern humans played a decisive role in the extinction of Neanderthals. The exact mechanism, however, remains genuinely uncertain. The simplest hypothesis is direct, violent competition, that modern humans killed Neanderthals. This is not impossible. Modern humans were capable of violence, as every subsequent period of human history demonstrates. They had weapons and organizational capacities that may have been superior to those of Neanderthals in important ways. But the evidence for direct violent conflict between modern humans and Neanderthals is essentially absent from the fossil record. There are no Neanderthal sites with clear evidence of massacre by modern humans, no piles of Neanderthal bones with weapon marks consistent with the weapons modern humans were making at the time. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially given the limited sampling of any prehistoric period. But it does make the simple conquest hypothesis less compellingly supported than its popularity might suggest. A more subtle and probably more realistic possibility is competitive exclusion through ecological competition for the same resources. If modern humans and Neanderthals were hunting the same animals in the same landscapes, even without direct conflict, the arrival of a new and potentially more efficient competitor would gradually reduce the resources available to the existing population. Neanderthal populations, which were never particularly large, could have been pushed into smaller and smaller pockets of viable territory, each local extinction reducing the total population further until the population was too small and too fragmented to sustain itself. This process could have played out over thousands of years with no single dramatic confrontation, and it would leave little archaeological signature beyond the gradual disappearance of Neanderthal sites from the record. Disease is another possibility that has attracted serious consideration. When previously isolated populations come into contact, the exchange of pathogens can be devastating to the population, with less immunological experience of the relevant diseases. The modern human populations that left Africa had been exposed to, and developed some resistance to, the diseases prevalent in the environments they had moved through. Neanderthals, having evolved in isolation from African pathogen landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years, may have had little or no resistance to diseases that modern humans carried without serious symptoms. A single epidemic could have decimated a Neanderthal community far more effectively than any military action. Multiple such introductions over the period of contact could have driven a series of local extinctions that eventually added up to the disappearance of the entire population. And there is interbreeding itself as a mechanism of disappearance, a process sometimes called assimilation. If the rate of gene flow between modern humans and Neanderthals was high enough relative to the size of the Neanderthal population, the Neanderthal population could have been genetically absorbed into the modern human population over time, with each generation producing more mixed ancestry individuals and fewer individuals who were predominantly Neanderthal in ancestry. Under this scenario, Neanderthals did not go extinct in the conventional sense, but were diluted into the larger, more numerous modern human gene pool until they had effectively ceased to exist as a distinct population, even as their genes lived on in the descendants. Some researchers have made careful arguments for this view, and the genetic data is not entirely inconsistent with it, though most analysts conclude that assimilation alone is insufficient to explain the pattern, and that some additional driver of Neanderthal disappearance must be invoked. Disclaimer: this video contains fictional and / or AI-assisted elements created for artistic and entertainment purposes. It does not aim to mislead viewers or present real-world events as factual documentation. The most likely answer, as with most complex historical questions, is that multiple factors operated simultaneously, and that their relative importance varied by time and place. In some regions, disease may have been the primary driver. In others, competition for resources may have mattered most. In some populations, assimilation may have been the primary mechanism of disappearance. Direct conflict may have played a role in some encounters, even if it was not the dominant mechanism across the whole range of contact. The disappearance of the Neanderthals was not a single event but a process, playing out across thousands of years and tens of thousands of square kilometers And the process was probably different in different places and at different times. There is something that modern humans have been for roughly 40,000 years. Something so consistent across all of recorded history and all of human memory that we have stopped noticing it. We are the only kind of human being on Earth. Homo sapiens has no co-inhabitants of the human niche. There is no other species that makes tools and symbolic art and fires and shelters, that buries its dead and cares for its sick, that uses complex language and builds social structures of great sophistication, that is recognizably and undeniably human in a way that we would not be able to explain away if we encountered it. We are alone in this way, and we have been alone in it for so long that we take the aloneness entirely for granted, as though it were a natural feature of the world rather than a historical contingency that might easily have been different. But consider what the world was like for the people who lived through the transition, the people who were alive when the Neanderthals were still present in Europe, the people who were alive when the last of the Denisovans were still occupying caves in the mountains of Asia or the forests of Southeast Asia. These were people who lived in a world with more than one kind of human being, and who therefore experienced something that no person alive today has any access to. The encounter with something that is clearly intelligent, and clearly tool-using, and clearly social, and clearly capable of complex behavior, and yet clearly not one of you, clearly belonging to a different lineage with a different history and a different way of being in the world. That experience must have been remarkable, and probably terrifying, and possibly also, in some encounters, something very different from terrifying. We have essentially no direct record of how modern humans experienced or understood their Neanderthal contemporaries. There are no cave paintings that clearly depict Neanderthals. There are no rock engravings that tell a story of encounter. There are no preserved oral traditions, even the most ancient ones we have access to, that clearly and explicitly describe the other kinds of human beings that our ancestors shared the world with, though some researchers have speculated that certain mythological beings in various traditions might reflect very distant folk memories of such encounters. What we have is silence, the silence of a world that is trying to make sense of something unprecedented and has no category for it. The experience of that encounter, whatever it was, shaped us. It shaped the people who experienced it, and through them, through the culture and the genes they passed on, it has shaped everyone who has come after. The genetic contribution of Neanderthals to our immune systems, to our pain sensitivity, to our adaptation to non-African environments is real and measurable and ongoing. But the cultural and psychological contribution, if there was one, is invisible and immeasurable. Did contact with the Neanderthals change how modern humans thought about what it meant to be human? Did it produce new categories of self and other? Did it contribute to the development of attitudes toward difference that have structured human societies ever since? We cannot know, but the questions are worth asking, because they point towards something important about the nature of the event, about what it means to have been the species that survived when others did not, about what we carry from that survival. Being the last is not the same as being the best. It is not evidence of superiority, as the ladder model of evolution would imply. The Neanderthals were not outcompeted by superior intelligence or superior virtue. They were outcompeted by numbers, by diseases they had no resistance to, by ecological disruption, by the contingent features of a particular historical moment in which a fast-expanding population, with certain specific advantages, encountered a smaller, more slowly reproducing population with different and perhaps more limited advantages in the specific circumstances of the encounter. If the circumstances had been slightly different, the outcome could have been different. There is nothing inevitable about the sole survivor status of Homo sapiens among the human species. And here is the thing that the genetic evidence makes most clear. We are not actually as alone as we appear to be. The Neanderthal is not entirely gone. The Denisovan is not entirely gone. They live in fragments in the specific DNA sequences that encode immune functions and altitude adaptation and aspects of physical appearance, scattered through the genomes of billions of living people. The encounter happened. The mixing happened. And the result of the mixing lives in us, making us something that we would not be if the encounter had never occurred, carrying forward a biological inheritance from beings who otherwise left nothing but silence and stone and bone fragments in the sediment of a world that had already forgotten they existed before we even began to remember them. The science that has revealed the forgotten human species to us is less than 3 decades old in its modern form, and its development is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of scientific achievement. To understand why ancient DNA analysis was so difficult to develop and why the results it has produced are so reliable and so remarkable, you need to understand what happens to DNA after an organism dies. DNA is not a stable molecule. It begins to degrade the moment an organism dies, attacked by enzymes within the cells themselves, and then by environmental factors, bacteria, fungi, acids in the soil, water, UV radiation. Within thousands of years, even under relatively favorable conditions, DNA has been broken into millions of tiny fragments, no longer the long double helix strands that encode genetic information in living cells, but short pieces of chemical wreckage, mixed together and contaminated with the DNA of all the other organisms that have passed through or been in contact with the ancient bone or tooth. Sequencing meaningful genetic information from this mess seemed, for a long time, essentially impossible. The first breakthrough came in the 1980s when researchers developed techniques for amplifying tiny quantities of DNA using the polymerase chain reaction, a method that makes millions of copies of a specific, short DNA sequence, making even trace quantities detectable. Early ancient DNA researchers used these techniques to sequence short DNA sequences from preserved specimens, producing results that seemed promising, but that were subsequently found, in many cases, to be contaminated with modern DNA from the researchers themselves or from the environment of the laboratory, producing sequences that looked ancient but were actually modern contamination. The field went through a period of intense skepticism, and rightly so. The development that changed everything was the combination of next-generation sequencing technology with rigorous contamination controls and sophisticated computational methods for authenticating ancient sequences. Next-generation sequencing reads millions or billions of short DNA fragments in parallel, producing a statistical picture of all the DNA in a sample, rather than just the specific sequences targeted by traditional PCR methods. Ancient DNA has characteristic damage patterns, specific chemical changes at the ends of fragments produced by thousands of years of degradation that distinguish it from modern contamination. By filtering for sequences with these damage patterns and using statistical methods to detect and correct for contamination, researchers can now extract reliably authentic ancient sequences, even from specimens tens of thousands of years old, as long as preservation conditions were cold enough and dry enough to slow the rate of DNA degradation. It was this technology, developed primarily through the work of Svante Pääbo and his colleagues, that allowed the sequencing of the first Neanderthal genome in 2010 and the discovery of the Denisovans from the Denisova cave fingerbone in the same year. These findings, published within weeks of each other, constituted what many researchers described as a revolution in paleoanthropology, a transformation in the nature and the precision of the questions that could be asked about human evolutionary history. Before these publications, the relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals was studied entirely through anatomy, through the comparison of fossil skulls and bones, producing ambiguous results that different researchers interpreted in radically different ways. After these publications, the relationship could be studied through direct comparison of genomes, producing results of a specificity and reliability that no anatomical comparison could match. In the years since 2010, the ancient DNA revolution has continued to accelerate. Researchers have now sequenced complete or near-complete genomes from dozens of Neanderthal and Denisovan individuals and from hundreds of ancient modern humans from across the world. The picture that has emerged is one of stunning complexity and of an almost incomprehensible richness of interaction among the human populations of the deep past, with evidence of multiple independent interbreeding events between modern humans and different Neanderthal populations, between modern humans and multiple distinct Denisovan populations, between Neanderthals and Denisovans themselves, and between modern humans and as yet unidentified archaic populations whose genetic signal appears in the genomes of modern Africans and other groups. The story of human evolution is not the story of a single population gradually changing. It is the story of a complex, dynamic, constantly shifting network of human populations, meeting and diverging and meeting again, exchanging genes and perhaps culture, reshaping each other in ways that we are only now beginning to understand. There is a concept in population genetics called a ghost population, and it is as evocative as it sounds. A ghost population is an ancient population whose existence is inferred from statistical signals in the genomes of its descendants. A population that has left a detectable genetic legacy but whose physical remains have not been found or identified. A population that is known to science only as an absence in the shape of something else. Ghost populations are detected when researchers analyze modern genomes and find ancestry components that cannot be explained by the known populations in the history of the people carrying them. Components that must have come from somewhere, from some other group, from some other branch of the human tree that has not yet been found. The existence of ghost populations is one of the most important and most underappreciated findings of the ancient DNA revolution, because it tells us that the inventory of human species we have identified so far is almost certainly incomplete. We have found the Neanderthals and the Denisovans because we have their bones, and we have been able to extract their DNA. We have found Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis because their bones are distinctive enough to be recognized as something new. But for every population whose bones happen to be recognizable and whose DNA happens to be preserved and detectable, there may be others whose remains have not been found, or have been found but not recognized as distinct, or have been destroyed by unfavorable preservation conditions. The genetic evidence suggests that multiple such ghost populations existed. Modern sub-Saharan African populations carry genetic ancestry from an archaic population that diverged from the ancestors of modern humans very early, possibly more than 400,000 years ago. A population that has not been identified in the fossil record, whose physical appearance and culture are completely unknown, and whose name in any language has been entirely lost to time. This ghost population contributed real genetic material to people alive today, material that influences the characteristics of the people who carry it. And yet, the ghost population itself is known only through statistical shadows in the genomes of its living descendants. In Asia, there is evidence for at least 2 genetically distinct Denisovan populations that interbred with modern humans at different times and places. One in Siberia or Central Asia, and one somewhere in Southeast Asia or the Pacific. And the differences between the genetic contributions of these two populations are large enough to suggest that they had been separated from each other for a very long time, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. These may represent two distinct geographic populations that had diverged to the point of being recognizably different, or they may even represent distinct species that were all grouped under the Denisovan label because of the limited physical evidence available to distinguish them. We simply do not know. Some researchers have suggested that Homo erectus, the long-lived and wide-ranging species that spread out of Africa roughly 2 million years ago, and persisted in some regions until perhaps 100,000 years ago or later, may have contributed to the ghost population signals detected in certain Asian and Pacific populations. Or may itself have been a source of some of the Denisovan-like genetic material that these populations carry. If so, the interbreeding events that produced modern humans from a complex mosaic of ancient populations go back even further in time than the Neanderthal and Denisovan encounters usually discussed. What all of this adds up to is a picture of human evolutionary history that is radically more complex, more interconnected, and more geographically tangled than anything that was imaginable even 20 years ago. The clean story of a single lineage of modern humans replacing a single lineage of archaic humans at a particular moment in time turns out to be a massive oversimplification of a reality in which multiple human lineages coexisted across vast stretches of time and geography, interacting with each other in ways that ranged from violent competition to intimate genetic mixing, and leaving behind in the living human gene pool a complex palimpsest of ancestries that tells a story far stranger and more beautiful than the story of simple replacement that used to seem so satisfying. Of all the facts that the ancient DNA revolution has revealed, the one that I find most humanizing and most difficult to fully process is the one about what happened when modern humans and Neanderthals met. Not what happened to the Neanderthals ultimately. That story ends in disappearance. What happened in individual encounters, in the meetings between specific people from different populations, in the years when modern humans were pushing into Neanderthal territory and the boundaries between the two groups were not the clean lines of historical categories, but the messy, permeable, humanly complicated realities of actual life. We know that Neanderthal and modern human populations interbred because the genetic signal of that interbreeding is detectable in modern human genomes. What we do not know, and may never know, is the human texture of those encounters. Who met whom under what circumstances, with what mixture of fear and curiosity and aggression and something else, and how the children produced by those encounters were raised and regarded, and what lives they lived. Were the encounters mutual and repeated over generations, creating stable mixed communities? Were they single events, rare and anomalous meetings between groups that were otherwise entirely separate? Were they violent in some cases and peaceful in others? Were the children recognized as belonging to the community of their mothers, or were they regarded as something strange, something in between? The genetic evidence is beginning to shed a little light on some of these questions. Analysis of the patterns of Neanderthal ancestry in modern human genomes reveals that the introgression, the entry of Neanderthal genetic material into the modern human gene pool, appears to have happened primarily through a small number of events rather than through constant, gradual mixing over the entire period of contact. This pattern is consistent with a small number of interbreeding episodes involving relatively few individuals, rather than with widespread ongoing mixing throughout the period when modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted. The children of those encounters survived and had descendants. The descendants were modern humans in the full genetic sense, but they carried fragments of Neanderthal ancestry that they passed on to their own children. and those fragments have been carried forward through all subsequent generations to the present day. There is also evidence that some Neanderthal genetic variants that entered the modern human gene pool through these encounters were subsequently weeded out by natural selection, particularly variants affecting reproductive fitness and cognitive function. The fact that Neanderthal ancestry is detectably but modestly present in modern human genomes, rather than being either entirely absent or present at much higher levels, is consistent with a model in which the initial Neanderthal contribution to the modern human gene pool was reduced over subsequent generations by selection against some Neanderthal variants, while other variants that were beneficial or neutral were maintained or even increased in frequency. This is a story of biology, but it is also a story about human beings. Those Neanderthal variants that were weeded out belonged to actual people who lived and breathed and hunted and slept. The variants that were retained and that now affect immune function and altitude adaptation and pain sensitivity in billions of living people came from actual Neanderthal individuals, people with specific faces and specific histories, people who died tens of thousands of years ago and whose bones have in most cases entirely dissolved, but whose genetic material persists, doing its quiet molecular work in the cells of their distant descendants, most of whom have never heard the name Neanderthal and have no idea that their immune system's ability to fight certain pathogens was shaped, however partially, by a lineage that supposedly went extinct 40,000 years ago. One of the most persistent and most difficult questions about the other human species that shared the Earth with our ancestors is whether they had symbolic thought, whether they could represent the world to themselves in abstract form, whether they made art, and if so, what that tells us about the nature of their minds. The question is difficult because the evidence is limited and ambiguous, and because the interpretation of that evidence depends heavily on assumptions about what symbolic thought requires and how it manifests. Assumptions that different researchers make differently and that interact in complicated ways with each other. For Neanderthals, the evidence of symbolic behavior has been accumulating steadily over the past 2 decades, and it has moved the center of gravity of scientific opinion substantially toward the conclusion that Neanderthal symbolic behavior was real, extensive, and independently developed rather than borrowed from modern humans. The evidence includes the use of ochre and manganese dioxide as pigments, found at Neanderthal sites across Europe long before modern humans arrived. It includes the collection and modification of eagle talons, which appear to have been worn as jewelry, at sites in Croatia dated to more than 130,000 years ago, making them older than any modern human ornament yet found. It includes the arrangement of stalagmites in a circular pattern in a French cave, a pattern that required deliberate planning and effort, and that has been dated by uranium series methods to more than 176,000 years ago, long before modern humans were present in Europe. And it includes, most dramatically, cave paintings. The cave art of Europe has long been attributed entirely to modern humans, on the assumption that only modern humans had the cognitive capacity for symbolic visual representations. But in 2018, researchers announced the results of dating campaigns at 3 cave sites in Spain, and the results were remarkable. Some of the paintings in those caves, including geometric shapes, discs, and a hand stencil, had been produced more than 65,000 years ago, more than 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. The only human beings in Europe at that time were Neanderthals. If those dates are correct, and they have been contested but not, as of the most recent assessments, convincingly refuted, then Neanderthals were painting on cave walls, making symbolic marks on permanent surfaces, engaging in the same fundamental representational practice that produced the spectacular animal paintings of Lascaux and Altamira that we have always associated exclusively with modern human creativity. This finding, if it stands, has profound implications for how we understand the cognitive relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans. It suggests that the impulse toward symbolic representation, toward marking the world with evidence of a mind that sees it as full of meaning, is not a unique feature of the modern human lineage that distinguished us from our archaic contemporaries. It may be an older and more widely shared feature of the genus Homo, present in Neanderthals and perhaps in other species as well. An expression of cognitive capacities that evolved in the shared ancestry of multiple human lineages, rather than arising for the first time in our own. If Neanderthals were making art independently of modern humans, the two populations were more cognitively similar than the old picture assumed. And the idea that modern humans replaced Neanderthals because of a fundamental intellectual superiority becomes correspondingly harder to sustain. For the Denisovans, the evidence of symbolic behavior is much sparser, simply because we have so much less physical material from their occupation sites. But what exists is suggestive. The Denisova cave itself has produced, in addition to the hominin bones, a chlorite bracelet of sophisticated manufacture, decorated with a drilled hole that dates to roughly 50,000 years ago. The bracelet shows evidence of high-speed drilling that some researchers have argued implies the use of a rotary drill, a technology not previously associated with archaic human populations. Whether this artifact was made by Denisovans or by early modern humans who also inhabited the cave at various times is a matter of ongoing debate. But if it is Denisovan in manufacture, it represents a level of technological sophistication that is genuinely impressive. What does it mean to recognize that the other human species that once shared the Earth were making symbolic marks on permanent surfaces, were adorning themselves with jewelry, were managing their environments with technologies of real complexity? It means, at minimum, that the gap we imagined between ourselves and them was smaller than we thought. It means that the distinction between human and non-human, always a fraught and complicated line, was not where we placed it. It means that we shared the Earth not with clever animals who happened to look somewhat like us, but with beings who were doing many of the same things we do, who were leaving their marks on the world in ways that say, clearly and unmistakably, we were here, we saw the world as meaningful, we had something we wanted to say. Roughly 40 to 50,000 years ago, something happened that transformed the human world from one of remarkable diversity into the world of a single kind of human being that has persisted ever since. The precise timing varied across different regions. In Europe, Neanderthals appear to have disappeared within a few thousand years of modern human arrival. In Asia, Denisovans persisted in at least some areas until perhaps 30 to 40,000 years ago, possibly later. Homo floresiensis on Flores may have survived until 50 or 60,000 years ago, possibly in contact with modern humans, possibly in isolation. The little-known and recently discovered Homo luzonensis in the Philippines had an uncertain end date. And the ghost populations, the ones we know only through genetic shadows, disappeared into whatever biological fates they met without leaving enough direct evidence to reconstruct the specific story of their passing. What the world looked like at the moment before this transition is something we can only partially reconstruct. There were, in the broad strokes, at least 4 distinct human populations alive simultaneously. Modern humans across Africa and beginning to spread into Asia and Europe, Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans somewhere in Asia, in populations that may themselves have been multiple distinct groups, and at least one, and probably more, ghost populations of archaic humans whose precise geographic ranges and relationships to the better-known groups are unclear. This was a world of human diversity unlike anything that has existed in the 50,000 years since. There were different kinds of faces, different configurations of skulls, different cognitive styles shaped by millions of years of evolution in different environments, different cultural and technological traditions, different ways of being human. And then, within what is, in geological terms, an instant, all of that diversity collapsed into one. The ending of that diversity is not something our culture has ever properly mourned or acknowledged. We have no ceremonies for it. We have no mythology that fully grasps it. We have no stories that we tell our children about what was lost when the world became a world of only one kind of human being. And this is partly because the loss was so long ago that even the most ancient oral traditions cannot reach it, and partly because for most of human history, we did not even know that there had been anything to lose. Only now, with the tools of ancient genetics and with the fossil record beginning to be read in its full complexity, are we beginning to understand that the world we were born into, a world in which Homo sapiens has no co-inhabitants of the human niche, is a historically anomalous and in some ways impoverished version of what the human world once was. There is something that cannot be recovered from the ending of that diversity. The specific knowledge that Neanderthals had accumulated over 300,000 years in Europe is gone. Their specific ecological understanding, their specific technological traditions, their specific ways of making meaning in the world. The Denisovan knowledge of the landscapes they inhabited, which apparently included some of the most demanding environments on Earth, is gone, except for the fragments that may be encoded in the genes they left behind in living populations. The cultural diversity, the multiplicity of ways of being human, the world that had room for more than one answer to the question of what a human being is, that world ended, and nothing that has been built since has restored what was lost in its ending. Whether we bear moral responsibility for what happened is a question that might seem absurd applied to events 40,000 years old, to people so distant from us that the chain of responsibility stretching back to them is invisible and untraceable. But it is a question worth asking because it forces us to confront something real about what kind of beings we are, about the relationship between our species and the others we have shared the world with, about the pattern that may have begun in the Pleistocene and has continued with devastating consistency into the historical period and the present. The pattern of expansion and displacement, of the human world contracting around the needs and the presence of one particular group until there is no room left for anyone else. There is something important that gets lost in the abstract discussion of ancient DNA and population genetics and evolutionary theory, something that needs to be brought back to the physical, the specific, the immediately real, what actually remains of the other human beings who once shared the earth with us. Not their genes in our bodies, though those are real too, but the physical objects, the bones and teeth and stone tools that have survived in the ground and that you can, in some cases, stand in front of in a museum and look at and try to grasp the reality of. A Neanderthal skull is immediately recognizable as different from a modern human skull, but the differences are more subtle than popular illustrations often suggest. The overall shape is more elongated, what anatomists describe as a prognathic face that protrudes forward more than a modern human face does. The brow ridges are more prominent, a continuous shelf of bone above the eye sockets that is conspicuous compared to the much more modest brow ridges of modern humans. The forehead slopes more sharply. The back of the skull has a distinctive protrusion, a bun-like occipital region that gives Neanderthal skulls a characteristic silhouette from the side. But the brain case itself is large, clearly housing a brain of substantial volume, and the overall impression is not of something radically non-human, but of something differently human, a variation on a theme that is recognizably related to ourselves while being unmistakably distinct. The rest of the Neanderthal skeleton is similarly distinctive. The body was powerfully built, with bones of greater density and more robust musculature than typical modern humans, an adaptation to the demanding physical life of a hunter in Ice Age Europe, who had to pursue and kill large game at close range. The limb proportions are slightly different, with shorter forearms and lower legs, relative to the upper limbs, which is characteristic of populations adapted to cold climates. The ribcage was barrel-shaped, broader than the typically narrower modern human chest. Neanderthal hands show patterns of wear and injury, consistent with close-contact hunting and with intense use of stone tools, leaving marks on the bones that tell a story of lives spent in strenuous physical engagement with a demanding world. Standing in front of a Neanderthal fossil in a museum, knowing what you now know about who they were, you can try to do something that the history of paleoanthropology has not always made easy. See them as they were, not as what popular culture has made of them. Not as the brutish evolutionary failure, not as the noble savage, not as any of the other inadequate and distorting projections that humans have applied to their archaic relatives. As a human being of a different and now gone kind, shaped by millions of years of evolution in a different environment from ours, carrying a different history, with a different face and a different skull and a different way of moving through the world, but unmistakably, inescapably, deeply, and genuinely human. What we cannot see in the bone is the face that covered it, the expression that crossed it, the specific coloring of the eyes and skin and hair that genetics is beginning to suggest may have varied considerably across Neanderthal populations. We cannot see the movement, the way this person walked and held their head and used their hands. We cannot hear the voice that came from this throat, cannot know the specific language that organized these thoughts into communication. What we can see is enough to know that there was a person here, a real and specific person who lived and breathed and experienced a world that was their world as fully as this world is ours, and who is now so thoroughly gone that only their bones remain, and even those are becoming fewer as they dissolve in the acids of the earth, leaving finally nothing but the genes in our bodies that remember, without knowing they remember, that we were not always alone. Here is the thing that sits with me most persistently when I think about the other human species that once shared the earth with our ancestors, the thing that no amount of genetic data or fossil analysis or archaeological reconstruction can fully address. We will never be able to talk to them. We will never be able to ask the Neanderthal who painted on the walls of a Spanish cave what they saw in the patterns they made, what those patterns meant to them, what they were trying to do. We will never be able to ask the Denisovan who climbed to 3,000 meters altitude in Tibet why they were there, what the landscape meant to them, whether the thinness of the air at that altitude felt to them the way the thinness of some other essential thing feels to us when we are in the wrong place. We will never be able to ask the tiny people of Flores whether they knew they were different from the other humans they may have encountered, and if so, what they made of the difference. The silence of the other human species is absolute. Not partial, not a silence produced by the loss of written records that might in principle be reconstructed from other evidence. Absolute. Whatever they said and thought and felt and believed and wondered about is gone with a completeness that cannot be overstated. And the only thing that remains of their inner lives is the material evidence they left behind. The bones and the tools, and the pigments, and the rare and precious marks they made on surfaces that were permanent enough to survive to our day. And while that evidence tells us, with increasing clarity and specificity, what they did and how they did it, it cannot tell us what it was like to be them. It cannot tell us whether they dreamed, whether they grieved the way we grieve, whether they experienced the particular human longing for something they could not name. It cannot tell us whether they knew that the world they inhabited was going to end, that the species expanding into their territory was going to be the last one standing, that the human diversity they were part of was going to collapse into a single lineage whose descendants would one day find their bones and try to understand who they had been. This silence is not comfortable, and it should not be. It is the silence of a loss so complete that there is no way to take its measure from within the single surviving lineage that is left to think about it. We are trying to understand beings who are gone, using the tools of a species that may be, in some ways, responsible for their going, carrying in our bodies the genetic material of the beings we are trying to understand, and yet unable to bridge the fundamental gap between what the genes tell us and what we most want to know, which is what it felt like to be one of them. Perhaps the closest we can come is through the objects they made. The bracelet from Denisova Cave, if it is Denisovan, was made by someone who wanted to wear something beautiful, who saw decorative value in a smooth piece of green chlorite with a carefully drilled hole, who knew how to produce the high-speed rotation needed to drill the hole cleanly, and who put the thing on their wrist and presumably felt something when they did, something in the range of what we feel when we put on something that makes us feel like ourselves. The eagle talons from the Croatian site were made into jewelry by someone who saw in the largest talons of one of Europe's most impressive birds something worth keeping and wearing close to the body, something that perhaps meant strength or power, or a connection to the qualities of the animal, something that mattered enough to warrant the effort of making it wearable. The pigment on the cave walls of Spain was put there by someone who saw the blank surface of the cave as an invitation to make a mark, who chose to make that mark in a particular way, in a particular place, and who presumably stood back and looked at what they had done with whatever the Neanderthal equivalent of aesthetic satisfaction felt like. These are not the actions of beings whose inner lives were empty. They are the actions of beings for whom the world was suffused with meaning, who responded to that meaning in ways that we recognize as fundamentally similar to how we respond to meaning, who were human in the sense that matters most, which is not the anatomical sense, but the experiential one. And they are gone, and we are here, and the only honest response to that situation is to try to understand it as fully as we can, and to acknowledge the weight of what their disappearance means. Not just a biological event in deep time, but the ending of ways of being human that will never come again. The story of the forgotten human species does not end with their disappearance. It continues in ways that are scientifically active and that carry implications for our understanding of ourselves in the present, not just in the deep past. The research continues at an accelerating pace, with new findings appearing every year that revise and deepen and sometimes overturn what was previously understood. The field is alive in a way that few areas of science can match, because the questions it is asking are so fundamental, and the tools for answering them are improving so rapidly. In the past few years alone, new species of ancient humans have been formally described. Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, whose teeth and bones reveal a mosaic of features that do not fit neatly into any previously known species, suggesting an evolutionary history on the islands of Southeast Asia that was more complex than anyone had imagined. There are also hints of further unknown populations in the genetics of modern humans, populations that may or may not correspond to known fossil species, and that are the subject of ongoing research. The Dragon Man specimen from China, a nearly complete skull found in Harbin and dated to more than 140,000 years ago, has been proposed as a member of a species called Homo longi that may be more closely related to modern humans than the Neanderthals were, though the interpretation is contested. The field is not settled. The story is not finished. Ancient DNA analysis continues to reveal new complexity in the relationships among ancient human populations. Every new genome sequenced from an ancient individual adds a data point to a picture that is becoming, with every addition, more nuanced and more remarkable. The number of interbreeding events between different human populations that can be detected through careful genetic analysis continues to grow. The geographic range of known archaic human genetic contributions to modern human genomes continues to expand. The timeline over which these contributions occurred continues to be extended back in time as new data comes in. And the implications of all this for how we understand modern human variation are beginning to be appreciated in a way that is important beyond the narrow confines of paleoanthropology. The genetic traits that we carry from our Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestors are not uniformly distributed across all modern human populations. Different populations carry different suites of ancient variants, reflecting the specific geographic encounters their ancestors had with specific archaic populations in specific places. This means that modern human genetic diversity includes components that are, in a real sense, much older than modern humans themselves. Components that descend from lineages that separated from our own lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago, and that rejoined the modern human gene pool through the encounters described in this story. The human genome is not a simple record of a single lineage. It is a palimpsest, a layered document, carrying traces of a history far more complex than the history of any single species. There is a night, somewhere in the mountains of Europe, perhaps 42,000 years ago, that I think about sometimes when I am trying to grasp the full weight of what we have been talking about tonight. It is a night when the first fully modern humans, the people who are in the direct biological lineage of every human being alive today, were moving through a landscape that already had inhabitants. The firelight of Neanderthal camps was visible from the ridgetops. The stone tools of a different kind of human being were lying in the sediment of streams that both kinds of people drank from. The children of two groups that were distinct enough to be called different species but similar enough to interbreed were, somewhere, alive in the world, carrying the genetics of both lineages. We do not know what happened on that night. We do not know if the two groups saw each other, what they thought when they did, whether what happened next was violent or curious, or simply the parallel movements of two populations that mostly avoided each other. We know only the outcome, that one group persisted and spread until it occupied every continent, and that the other group gradually disappeared, leaving behind their genes in the bodies of the group that survived, and their bones in the sediment of the landscape they once inhabited. The other human species that shared the earth with our ancestors were not monsters or savages or evolutionary failures. They were human beings of different kinds, shaped by different evolutionary histories, with different faces and different skulls and different ways of being in the world, and the world was richer for having them in it. The world is poorer for their absence, though we have been too long in recognizing the poverty as a loss rather than simply as the natural order of things. We carry them in our bodies, in the specific sequences of DNA that once belonged to beings who are now entirely gone except for those traces. And that knowledge, when you let it settle, changes something about how you understand yourself. You are not simply the product of a single lineage. You are the product of encounters, of mixings, of a history of contact and merger and divergence that goes back hundreds of thousands of years and involves beings who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Tonight, lying in whatever darkness surrounds you, you are the surviving member of the last lineage standing, the sole representative of what was once a diverse and complex human family. The Neanderthals' descendants are in you. The Denisovans' descendants are in you, if you are of non-African ancestry. Ghost populations whose names we do not know and whose bones we may never find are in you too, as whispers in the genetic record, as ancestral contributions to the specific person you are. You are not separate from the forgotten species. You are, in a small but real and measurable way, one of their descendants. The research that has made all of this visible is ongoing, accelerating and producing new findings every year that deepen and sometimes overturn what we thought we knew. If this story has moved you, if the discovery that we were not alone resonates in a way that feels important, if understanding the depth and the complexity and the strangeness of the human family history shifts something in how you see yourself and your species, then please subscribe to this channel. I make these videos because this story deserves to be told in a way that does justice to its depth, in a way that brings the science to people who might not otherwise encounter it, in a way that makes the forgotten species feel like what they were, which is real and important and part of the human story in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you. I read all the comments, and there is something genuinely moving to me about knowing that people across the world are lying down in their own darknesses and thinking about the Neanderthal who painted on a cave wall 65,000 years ago, about the Denisovan whose altitude-adapted genes live in Tibetan mountain people today, about the tiny people of Flores who hunted dwarf elephants on an island and then vanished into the same silence that has swallowed all the others. They were here, they were real, they mattered, and in the most literal biological sense they are still with us, still part of the ongoing story of what it means to be human on this planet in this particular moment, in the long, strange, branching history of the genus that eventually produced, among its many varied expressions, you. Sleep well, wherever you are. The forgotten are not entirely forgotten. Some of them are sleeping in your cells. The discovery of Homo floresiensis in 2003 was not simply an exciting archaeological find. It was a scientific earthquake that demonstrated, in the most vivid possible way, how little we actually understand about the diversity of human life in the recent past, and how many discoveries might still be waiting in the limestone caves and river sediments of Southeast Asia and other underexplored regions. Before 2003, the general consensus in paleoanthropology was that by roughly 100,000 years ago, the only hominin species still alive was Homo sapiens, possibly alongside some late persisting Neanderthals in Europe. The idea that a completely unknown species of human being, a species with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's, had been living and making sophisticated tools on an island in Indonesia until at most 60,000 years ago was not merely unexpected. It was, to many researchers, initially simply incredible. The initial resistance to accepting Homo floresiensis as a genuine distinct species was intense and sometimes personal. Some researchers proposed that the Liangbua remains belonged to a modern human who had suffered from microcephaly, a developmental condition that produces abnormally small brains and heads. Others suggested other pathological conditions. The debate went on for years, and the tone was sometimes unpleasant because the stakes of the claim were high. If Homo floresiensis was a real species, it overturned assumptions that had structured thinking about human evolution for decades. If it was a pathological modern human, the exciting discovery dissolved into a more mundane medical story. The argument has now been essentially settled in favor of a genuine, distinct species. Multiple subsequent analyses of the bones have shown features that cannot be explained by any known modern human pathology. Features that fit consistently with the hypothesis of a small-bodied, small-brained hominin, descended from a larger-bodied ancestor through island dwarfism. The wrists, the feet, the shoulder joints all show primitive features that are inconsistent with the proposed pathological explanations, and consistent with a lineage that diverged from the modern human line very early, possibly representing a descendant of an earlier and more primitive hominid than previously thought. But the more important question raised by Homo floresiensis, the one that resonates beyond the specific case, is this. If a completely unknown species of human being had been living in Southeast Asia until 60,000 years ago, without any hint in the fossil record that was accessible to researchers before 2003, how many other unknown species might be waiting to be found? The islands of Southeast Asia include thousands of individual islands, many of them with extensive limestone cave systems that are perfect for preserving ancient bones, and most of which have never been archaeologically surveyed with the thoroughness that even a few decades of serious work would require. The mainland regions of continental Southeast Asia, with their wet tropical soils that destroy bone quickly, are poorly represented in the fossil record, not because nothing was there, but because the preservation conditions are hostile. The discovery of Homo luzonensis in the Philippines in 2019 confirmed that the answer to the question about unknown species is at least one more, and possibly many more. Homo luzonensis is known from teeth and bones found in Calao Cave in the northern Philippines, dated to roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, and its features are sufficiently distinctive and sufficiently different from any previously known species that its describers felt confident asserting it as a genuinely new taxon. The combination of features it shows, including teeth that are remarkably small for a hominin of its inferred body size, shoulder and hand bones with archaic features, and other anatomical details, does not fit neatly into any existing species, suggesting either an independent evolution on the Philippines or the descendant of an earlier and more archaic hominin population that arrived on the island by some means and then diverged into its current form. What these discoveries are collectively telling us is that Southeast Asia during the period of greatest human diversity was a region of extraordinary richness in human forms, a region where island isolation repeatedly produced divergent evolutionary trajectories in hominin populations, a region where different kinds of human beings were living their lives in different island environments with minimal contact, each one following its own evolutionary path. This picture is almost certainly incomplete because the fossil record of the region is so limited. There are almost certainly other species waiting to be found, other populations whose bones are in caves that have not been excavated or in sediments that have not been surveyed. The history of human diversity in Southeast Asia is probably far stranger and far richer than even the remarkable discoveries of the past 2 decades have revealed. One of the most counterintuitive findings of the ancient human genetics revolution is that some of the genetic contributions made by archaic human populations to the modern human gene pool are not merely neutral variants carried along by chance, but actively useful adaptations that have been maintained and sometimes increased in frequency in modern populations because they confer genuine advantages. This finding reverses a naive expectation that the genes of more primitive or archaic populations would be disadvantageous when introduced into modern human genomes, an expectation based on the incorrect assumption that more ancient automatically means less adapted or less functional. The reality is more interesting and more illuminating. The Tibetan altitude adaptation story is the clearest and most extensively documented case, and it is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates perfectly how the exchange of genes between archaic and modern populations could have been, in certain respects and for certain traits, genuinely beneficial. The Tibetan Plateau, sits at an average elevation of more than 4,000 meters above sea level, with major population centers at 3,000 to 4,000 meters. At these elevations, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air is roughly 60% of what it is at sea level, and this hypoxic environment presents serious physiological challenges to human beings adapted to lower altitudes. The most immediate problem is that less oxygen is available for the metabolic processes that sustain muscle activity and maintain organ function, and most lowland-adapted humans respond to hypoxia by producing more red blood cells, a response that helps in the short term but that at high altitude leads to dangerously thick blood that is prone to clotting and that strains the heart. Tibetan people, and to a lesser extent some other high-altitude Asian populations, do not respond to the low oxygen of high altitude in this maladaptive way. They have a suite of genetic adaptations that allow them to thrive at altitude without the problematic increases in red blood cell production, maintaining normal blood viscosity while their bodies extract oxygen more efficiently from the thinner air. The most important of these adaptations involves a gene called EPAS1, which plays a crucial role in the oxygen-sensing pathway that regulates red blood cell production. Tibetan people have versions of this gene that are different from the versions found in lowland-adapted populations, and these Tibetan versions appear to modulate the altitude response in ways that are advantageous for high-altitude living. When researchers examined the specific sequences of EPAS1 variants that Tibetan people carry, they found that these sequences were almost identical to sequences found in the Denisova cave genome, the genome of the Denisovans. The Denisovans, who were apparently living in the Tibetan Plateau region or nearby areas, had evolved adaptations to high-altitude living over a very long period of time. And when modern humans interbred with them or their close relatives in the region, some individuals acquired the Denisovan EPAS1 variants through that interbreeding. In the high-altitude environment that the descendants of those individuals moved into, the Denisovan EPAS1 variants conferred a genuine survival advantage, and natural selection increased their frequency in the Tibetan population over subsequent generations. The result is that the people who now inhabit one of the most challenging environments on Earth owe part of their ability to do so to a genetic contribution from a population that has been extinct for tens of thousands of years. Neanderthal genetic contributions to modern human immunity have also been studied extensively, and the findings are similarly interesting. The immune system faces a constant evolutionary arms race with pathogens, and populations that have been exposed to specific pathogens over long periods of time develop adaptations to those pathogens that may not be as effective against pathogens from different geographic regions. When modern humans moved out of Africa and into the environments that Neanderthals occupied, they encountered pathogen landscapes that were different from those of Africa, landscapes with organisms that Neanderthals had been adapting to for hundreds of thousands of years. By acquiring Neanderthal immune variants through interbreeding, modern humans were able to shortcut the slow process of developing those adaptations independently, picking up in a single generation what might otherwise have required millennia of natural selection. Several specific Neanderthal-derived immune variants have been identified in modern humans, including variants of the TLR genes, which encode pattern recognition receptors that detect the molecular signatures of bacteria, fungi, and other pathogens, and variants of genes involved in the response to specific viral infections. These variants appear to have been selectively maintained in modern human populations exposed to the relevant pathogens, suggesting that they conferred real protective advantages. Modern humans who acquired these variants from Neanderthal ancestors were, in some measurable sense, better equipped to survive the pathogens they encountered in the environments that Neanderthals had occupied, and the descendants of those better adapted individuals are alive today, still carrying the Neanderthal variants in their genomes, still benefiting from a genetic gift that was given tens of thousands of years before recorded history began. To understand the forgotten human species properly, you need to understand the nature of the archaeological record and why it is so incomplete. Because the incompleteness is not random but systematic. And understanding the pattern of what is preserved and what is not is essential to not being misled by the absence of evidence into assuming that nothing existed where we have found nothing. The fundamental problem is that the preservation of organic material in the ground is the exception rather than the rule. Bones, teeth, and other hard tissues of the body can persist for tens or hundreds of thousands of years under the right conditions, but those conditions are specific and relatively rare. Cold temperatures that slow bacterial decay, low humidity that prevents chemical dissolution, alkaline soil chemistry that doesn't dissolve the mineral component of bone, burial under sediment quickly enough to prevent exposure to surface weathering. Most of the Earth's surface does not provide these conditions, and most of the bones of ancient humans that have ever existed have long since dissolved into the soil without leaving any trace that would survive to be found by archaeologists. The practical implication is that the fossil record of ancient humans is a radically non-random sample of all the ancient humans that ever lived. It overrepresents populations who lived in environments with favorable preservation conditions, such as the limestone cave systems of Europe and certain arid regions of Africa, and it dramatically underrepresents populations who lived in environments where preservation is poor, such as the wet tropical forests of Southeast Asia and equatorial Africa. It overrepresents individuals who happen to die or be buried in locations where sediment accumulation was happening, and it underrepresents individuals who died in the open landscape where their remains were scattered by scavengers and exposed to weathering. The result is that the geographic distribution of known fossil human remains is not a map of where ancient humans actually lived, but rather a map of where the conditions for fossil preservation happen to have coincided with the actual presence of ancient humans. Europe is massively overrepresented in the Neanderthal fossil record, not because Europe was the most important part of the Neanderthal range, but because Europe has abundant limestone cave systems that are perfect for fossil preservation and that have been systematically searched by archaeologists for more than a century. The Asian part of the Neanderthal range, which was geographically large and almost certainly ecologically important, is represented by a much smaller number of specimens, partly because there have been fewer systematic searches, and partly because preservation conditions in some parts of Asia are less favorable. The cave sites that have been investigated in Central Asia and the Middle East have produced important Neanderthal material, but the picture is inevitably incomplete. For the Denisovans, the problem of incomplete sampling is even more acute. The genetic evidence tells us clearly that Denisovans ranged widely across Asia, potentially from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and that they interbred with modern human populations across this entire range. But the physical fossil record for Denisovans consists of a handful of fragments from a single cave in Siberia and a jawbone from Tibet. This disproportion between what the genetics tells us and what the bones show us is startling and informative. It tells us that there must be enormous amounts of Denisovan physical material in the ground across Asia that has simply not been found yet, either because the sites have not been excavated or because the preservation conditions are poor enough that nothing has survived. The Denisovans are geographically one of the most widely distributed archaic human populations we know about, and yet their physical remains are among the scantiest of any recognized species. This situation should make us humble about what we do not know. If the Denisovans, a population widespread enough to have interbred with modern humans across the breadth of Asia, had managed to leave us only a few scraps of bone until their genetic signal in living humans revealed their existence, how many other populations might have left even less? The ghost populations detectable in modern human genomes may represent only a fraction of the diversity that actually existed. The human family tree may have had many more branches than even the current, newly expanded understanding recognizes. The world that modern humans entered when they expanded out of Africa may have been more densely populated with different kinds of human being than the fossil record can currently show. Long before modern genetics and ancient DNA analysis gave us the tools to detect and characterize the other human species that once shared the Earth with our ancestors, people were telling stories. Stories about beings who were almost human but not quite, who lived in the wild places, who were encountered at the edges of the known world, who were dangerous or magical or pitiable or frightening. It is tempting, and many researchers have been tempted, to search in these stories for echoes of actual ancient encounters between our ancestors and the other human species who were their contemporaries, to find in folklore the faint memory of a world with more than one kind of human being. The Almas of Central Asia is one of the most discussed cases. Almas, also spelled Almasty or Albasty in different traditions, are described in the folklore of various Central Asian peoples as wild, hairy, human-like beings who walk upright, live in mountains or forests, occasionally interact with humans, and are generally described as neither fully human nor fully animal. Some accounts describe them as frighteningly strong, others as timid and reclusive. Some accounts have them using primitive tools. Some describe them as capable of simple communication. Across the considerable geographic range in which similar beings appear in folklore, the descriptions show remarkable consistency. Bipedal, covered in hair, human-like in basic form but different in the face and in general appearance, existing on the margins between the human world and the wild. Some researchers have proposed that these folklore traditions might preserve a very distant cultural memory of actual encounters between modern humans and archaic hominins, perhaps Neanderthals or Denisovans or other archaic populations, transmitted in altered form across tens of thousands of years through the mechanisms of oral tradition. The proposal is impossible to either prove or disprove, and most mainstream researchers treat it with appropriate skepticism, because the mechanisms by which a specific memory could be maintained across such vast spans of time through oral tradition are not well understood, and because the general form of the wild man or wild creature at the boundary between human and animal is a nearly universal feature of human mythology that may reflect deep-seated psychological tendencies rather than specific historical encounters. But the proposal cannot be entirely dismissed either. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions appear, in some cases documented by researchers, to preserve accurate descriptions of landscape features and geological events that occurred thousands of years ago, suggesting that oral traditions can, under the right conditions, maintain specific and accurate information across very long time spans. If the meeting of modern humans and Neanderthals or Denisovans produced experiences vivid and significant enough to become part of a community's oral tradition, the possibility that some echo of those experiences might persist in the subsequent mythology of the descendant populations is not zero, even if it is impossible to quantify. More concretely, various traditions across the world describe beings that are somewhere between human and animal. The Yeti of the Himalayas, the Bigfoot of North American indigenous traditions, the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, the Yowie of Australia. None of these have been confirmed to exist by physical evidence, and most researchers regard them as almost certainly not physical animals. but their geographic distribution and their consistent features, bipedalism, hair-covered bodies, intelligence beyond typical animals, social behavior, are interesting, and in some cases they appear in regions where archaic hominin populations were actually present within the range of human memory. The orang pendek, a small bipedal hairy creature reported in the forests of Sumatra, appears in the folklore of people in exactly the region where Homo floresiensis or a related population might have persisted. Whether there is a connection is unknown, but the coincidence is at least worth noting. The instinct to find the other human species in folklore and mythology reflects something important about why this subject matters to us beyond its purely scientific interest. It is not just the genetic contribution of archaic humans to our own biology that makes their story significant. It is the fact that they were here, that our ancestors encountered them and had to make sense of the encounter, and that the human categories of self and other were forged, at least in part, in the context of a world that contained multiple kinds of human being. The mythology of the creature at the edge, the being that is almost but not quite human, the wild man in the wilderness, may or may not preserve specific memories of specific encounters, but it reflects the long history of human beings grappling with the existence of something that is close to them but not them, something that challenges the boundaries of their categories, something that forces them to think about what it means to be what they are. Imagine for a moment that you are a hunter living in Europe 43,000 years ago. You are moving through a landscape of mixed woodland and open grassland, following the traces of game, watching the sky for weather signs, knowing every part of this territory the way you know the inside of your own shelter. And then you see something. A figure at the edge of the trees, moving differently from any animal you know, upright, bipedal, the size of a large person. But the face, when it turns towards you, is not the face of anyone from your group. The brow is heavier, the nose is broader, the head has a different shape. The body is more powerfully built, the arms longer in proportion. It is looking at you with an expression you cannot quite read, an expression that might be curiosity, or might be fear, or might be something else entirely, something that does not map cleanly onto the emotional vocabulary you have available. What do you do? What does the other figure do? Are you afraid? You probably are, at least a little, because this is not something you have seen before. Are you curious? You probably are, because you are a human being with a human being's irrepressible curiosity. And whatever this thing is, it is remarkable and it requires explanation. Is there any way to communicate? You do not know. You do not know if this other figure has language in any form that connects with yours, if the sounds it makes could be passed into meaning by the same cognitive apparatus you use to process the speech of the people you know. You do not know if it is dangerous. You do not know if it is alone or whether there are others nearby. This scenario, in some form, happened, not once, but many times, across the period when modern humans were moving into Neanderthal territory, and the two populations were living in the same or adjacent landscapes. The specific details of any given encounter are completely beyond our knowledge. We know only that encounters happened because the genes tell us they did. The genetic signal of interbreeding is the permanent record of a history of contact, and while that record cannot tell us what any specific encounter was like, it tells us beyond all reasonable doubt that at least some of those encounters led to children, which means that at least some of them were intimate enough to produce a level of connection that we have no adequate word for in any modern language. The children of those encounters are perhaps the most interesting people we will never know anything specific about. They were, in the genetic sense, genuinely in between, carrying the genes of two populations that had been separate for hundreds of thousands of years, carrying in their bodies the two evolutionary histories that had produced two different kinds of human being. Walking through a world that must have offered them experiences that no one before them and no one after them has had access to. The experience of belonging to both and, fully, to neither. Were they accepted by the communities they lived in? Were they regarded as full members of the group? Were they treated differently? Were they celebrated or feared, or both? We do not know. We will never know. The only thing we know is that some of them reproduced, and that their descendants are among the billions of people alive today. The ancient DNA revolution has produced remarkable results, but it has also clarified with great precision how much we still do not know about the other human species that once shared the Earth with us. The field is advancing rapidly, but the pace of discovery has revealed the depth of the ignorance as much as it has reduced it, because each new finding raises new questions that were not even askable before the finding was made. We do not know with any confidence what the Denisovans looked like. We have their genomes, but not their faces. Some predictions about their physical appearance can be made from the genome, since some genes that influence physical characteristics are identifiable. But the reconstruction of a phenotype from a genome is still very imprecise, and the features predicted from the Denisovan genome include some that are unusual enough to make confident prediction difficult. The few bones we have, the molars that are distinctively large, and the jaw fragment from Tibet, tell us something about body proportions and skull shape, but not nearly enough to draw a picture of what a Denisovan individual actually looked like in life. We do not know the geographic boundaries of the Denisovan range. The genetic evidence suggests they were widespread across Asia, but the specific populations that the genetics is detecting may represent multiple distinct groups that were called Denisovans for convenience because they all descend from the ancestral population that split from the Neanderthal lineage, without being as closely related to each other as the term implies. The Denisovan contribution to Tibetan and Siberian populations may come from a different subpopulation than the contribution to Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations. And understanding those differences requires knowing more about the geographic structure of archaic human populations in Asia than we currently do. We do not know how many other unknown human populations existed. The ghost populations detectable in modern human genomes are real but poorly characterized. We know that archaic sequences in modern African genomes come from a population that diverged from the modern human lineage very early, but we do not know where this population lived, what they looked like, or whether they correspond to any known fossil species. We know that there are Denisovan-like sequences in populations across Asia that may represent multiple distinct source populations, but we cannot yet fully untangle which sequences came from which populations. The picture of archaic human diversity that is emerging from genomics is strikingly complex, and there is every reason to expect that further analysis will reveal it to be more complex still. We do not know why some Neanderthal genetic variants were maintained in modern human populations, and others were eliminated by selection. Some of the elimination was almost certainly due to reduced fitness of hybrid individuals for certain traits, particularly those affecting cognitive function and reproductive biology, which are often the first to be disrupted when two long-separated populations interbreed. But the specific patterns of which variants were retained and which were lost are not fully understood, and the implications of those patterns for the characteristics of modern humans are only beginning to be explored. We do not know, with any confidence, exactly why the other human species disappeared. The models are suggestive and the timing is telling, but the actual mechanisms, the specific processes that drove specific populations to extinction in specific places, remain poorly understood. The history of the Neanderthal extinction in Europe, for example, is not a single event but a series of local extinctions that played out differently in different regions and at different times, and the drivers of those local extinctions were probably different in different places. The overall extinction is the sum of many local histories, and we understand very few of those histories in enough detail to say what actually happened. And we do not know what the world of multiple human species was like from the inside. This is the deepest and most fundamental ignorance, the one that no amount of genomic data or fossil analysis can fully address. We can reconstruct the biology of the other species, their physical characteristics, some of their behaviors, something of their cognitive capacities. We cannot reconstruct their experience, what it was like to be one of them, how they understood themselves and their world, what they thought about the world they inhabited, what they hoped for and feared and loved. That inner life is permanently inaccessible, lost with the last individual of each species, leaving us with the bones and the genes, but not the minds that animated them. There is a lesson in the story of the forgotten human species that goes beyond the scientific interest of the specific findings, a lesson that concerns how we understand ourselves and our place in the world, and the nature of the categories we use to organize our experience of other beings. The existence of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and Homo floresiensis and all the others forces a rethinking of what we mean when we say human, because those beings were human in many of the most important senses while being clearly distinct from us in equally important ways. The concept of the human in everyday usage tends to be treated as a natural category with clear boundaries, as though there is an obvious and unambiguous distinction between the human and the non-human that anyone could recognize. The existence of the other human species undermines this comfortable certainty. If you had been able to meet a Neanderthal in the flesh, to see the intelligence in their eyes and watch the skill of their hands, and hear the sounds they made and understand that those sounds constituted language of some real complexity, and to know that this being was capable of making fire and sheltering their young and burying their dead and painting symbols on cave walls, you would have been forced to grapple with the fact that the boundary between the human and the non-human is not where you thought it was. You would have been standing in front of something that was not you, and was not you either, something that required a new category or a revision of the existing categories, something that the available vocabulary did not quite fit. This discomfort is productive. The encounter with the genuinely other, the thing that is close enough to be recognizable but different enough to resist easy categorization, is one of the most philosophically significant experiences available to a conscious being. It forces an examination of what the categories actually are and what work they are doing, a recognition that the categories may be more contingent and more permeable than they seemed before the encounter. If the Neanderthals were human, what does that tell us about what human means? If they were not human in some important sense, what exactly was missing from them that would make that judgment accurate? These are not merely academic questions. They are questions about the nature of mind and identity and community and the moral circle. Questions whose answers determine who and what we extend our concern and our obligations to. The story of the forgotten human species is also a story about diversity, about the value of having multiple kinds of something in the world rather than only one kind. The world of 40,000 years ago, with its multiple kinds of human being, was richer in a certain sense than the world we now inhabit. Richer in the diversity of ways of being human, in the multiplicity of cognitive styles and cultural traditions and evolutionary histories that were present simultaneously. The collapse of that diversity into a single lineage was a loss, whatever the causes and whatever the mechanisms. And the recognition of that loss should make us think more carefully about the diversity that still exists in the world, biological and cultural and cognitive, and about what it would mean to let more of it disappear. We are the only surviving kind of human being, and we have been for long enough that the condition of uniqueness has come to seem natural and inevitable. It was not natural, and it was not inevitable. It was the outcome of specific historical events in specific circumstances, and those events ended a diversity that had persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. Understanding what was lost in that ending is the first step towards something more important. Appreciating what diversity means and why its preservation matters, not as a sentimental preference, but as a recognition of the genuine value of having more than one way of being whatever you are. The final thought I want to leave you with, as you settle into the darkness and the quiet of wherever you are tonight, is not a scientific finding or a theoretical argument, but an image of what sleep looked like for the other human beings who once shared the earth with our ancestors. A Neanderthal woman in a cave in what is now France, 40,000 years ago, lying down in the darkness after a day of whatever the day contained, pulling the furs around herself against the cold, the sound of the fire settling, the sounds of the other people in the cave around her. The children already asleep, the men quiet, the night outside pressing against the entrance to the cave. She closes her eyes. Her body settles. The tension of the day releases. She sleeps. A Denisovan individual in the mountains of Asia 50,000 years ago, under the vast star field of an altitude night, wrapped in whatever insulation the environment provided, breathing the thin air of the plateau, the cold pressing in, the warmth of companions nearby. They sleep. The tiny people of Flores, in the forests of an island that time has not changed as much as we might think, small bodies under the canopy, the sounds of the night forest around them, the drip of moisture from the leaves, the calls of animals in the dark. They sleep, all of them sleeping, all of them doing the most universal and most necessary of all things, the thing that no living creature can indefinitely refuse, the surrender to rest and repair, and the temporary dissolution of conscious experience. All of them in whatever darkness was available to them, in the specific quality of their specific night. Dreaming, perhaps, processing the day in whatever way their brains processed the day, maintaining their bodies for another day of life in a world that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely beautiful, and genuinely full of more kinds of intelligent creatures than we have ever had since. They are gone now. The darkness they slept in is the same darkness you are in. The stars above their sleeping places are the same stars above yours. The biological necessity they surrendered to is the same biological necessity you are surrendering to now, tonight, wherever you are. And in a small but real sense, in the fragments of their genomes that some of you carry in your cells, they are in the darkness with you still. Not as ghosts, not in any mystical sense. In the most literal and biological of senses, in the specific sequences of DNA that once belonged to them and that now influence specific processes in specific cells in your specific body. Sleep well. You are descended from survivors, yes, but you are also, if only partially, descended from those who did not survive as a separate people, from the Neanderthal and the Denisovan and the others who are known and unknown, who were here and are not here anymore, who slept in their darknesses as you sleep in yours, and who left behind in you the only form of immortality that biology offers. The continuation, in altered and partial and diluted form, of themselves. The forgotten are not entirely forgotten. Some of them are sleeping in your cells tonight. Sleep well. Around 40 to 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record of modern human behavior undergoes a transformation so dramatic and so sudden on geological timescales that it has been called by various researchers the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the Creative Explosion, or the Great Leap Forward. Before this period, even anatomically modern Homo sapiens left behind a relatively sparse material culture, dominated by stone tools that were sophisticated, but not dramatically different from what Neanderthals were producing simultaneously. After this period, the record explodes with cave paintings of astonishing technical accomplishment and conceptual sophistication, with personal ornaments of extraordinary variety, with evidence of long-distance trade networks for prestige materials, with representational figurines including the famous Venus figurines of Upper Paleolithic Europe, with complex musical instruments including bone flutes of demonstrable melodic range, with evidence of elaborate burial practices, including the careful arrangement of bodies with significant grave goods. This transformation has been the subject of intensive research and sometimes fierce debate, because the question of what caused it is not simple, and the answer has significant implications for our understanding of human cognition and of the relationship between modern humans and the other species they were encountering during the same period. Some researchers argue that the cognitive change reflects a genetic mutation or change in brain wiring that produced new cognitive capacities, a biological change in the hardware of the human mind that suddenly made the full range of modern human behavior possible. Others argue that the change reflects cultural innovation rather than biological change, the development of new cultural practices and new forms of social organization that unlocked cognitive capacities that had existed all along but had not previously been fully expressed. Still others argue that the apparent revolution is partly an artifact of preservation and discovery bias, with earlier evidence of modern human symbolic behavior in Africa being underrepresented in the record simply because Africa has been less thoroughly surveyed than Europe. What is striking about the timing of the cognitive revolution, however, is that it coincides broadly with the period of most intensive contact between modern humans and the other human species they were encountering. Modern humans arrived in Europe around 45 to 42,000 years ago, the period of most intensive contact with Neanderthals. The genetic evidence for Neanderthal interbreeding is concentrated in a period that overlaps substantially with the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic Cultural Revolution. It is at least worth considering as a hypothesis that the encounter with the Neanderthals, who had been living in the specific environments that modern humans were entering for hundreds of thousands of years, may have contributed to the cultural explosion in some way. This is a speculative idea, and most researchers treat it cautiously. The contribution of Neanderthal genes to modern human cognition is, as noted above, likely small, and may have been partly selected against after the initial interbreeding events. The idea that the Cultural Revolution was caused or even substantially influenced by Neanderthal genes is probably too simple. But the broader hypothesis that the encounter with beings who were cognitively similar but culturally different, who had developed different technological traditions and different knowledge systems in the specific environments that modern humans were entering, might have stimulated cultural innovation through some combination of competition and exchange, is not unreasonable. The encounter with a genuine other, a being that is similar enough to be threatening but different enough to have something to teach, is a powerful driver of cultural change in the historical period, and there is no particular reason why it should not have been so in the deep past. The cognitive revolution that produced modern human cultural behavior in its fully elaborated form is one of the great mysteries of human prehistory, and the role of the encounter with other human species in that revolution, if any, is one of the most intriguing questions in the entire field. We cannot know the answer with current evidence. But the question is worth asking because it connects two of the most important and most interesting phenomena of the period: the appearance of fully modern human cultural behavior and the coexistence of multiple human species in the same landscapes in a way that might illuminate both. There is an ethical dimension to the story of the forgotten human species that is rarely discussed, but that deserves careful attention, because it raises questions about responsibility and culpability that, while they cannot be resolved in any conventional legal or moral framework, illuminate something important about what the ending of those species actually means and how we should relate to it. The question is simply whether the disappearance of the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and the other human species was something that our ancestors did in a morally significant sense, or simply something that happened, the neutral outcome of ecological competition and demographic dynamics in which no particular moral agency was involved. The answer is not straightforward, and its difficulty illuminates the nature of the event. On one hand, modern human expansion was not a consciously planned campaign of extermination. There is no evidence that our ancestors had a systematic program of eliminating the other human species. No evidence of the kind of intentional genocide that might invite direct moral condemnation in the way that historical atrocities against documented populations do. The processes that drove the other species to extinction were probably diffuse and gradual, operating through mechanisms like disease and resource competition that would not have been understood by the participants as mechanisms of extinction and that played out over centuries and millennia rather than in the kind of dramatic events that produce moral memory. On the other hand, if modern humans introduced diseases to Neanderthal populations that had no resistance to them, if they competed for resources in ways that gradually reduced Neanderthal territories and population sizes, if in some instances they used direct violence to defend resources or territory. These were actions with predictable consequences for populations that were already small and vulnerable. The fact that the actors may not have understood the full consequences of their actions, that they had no concept of species extinction or of the irreversibility of what was happening, does not change the fact that something was done that resulted in the elimination of entire populations of intelligent, socially complex beings who had as strong a claim to continued existence as any other living thing. The ethical discomfort of the question is perhaps its most important feature. We are, all of us, the biological beneficiaries of the displacement and eventual extinction of other human populations. The world that we inhabit, the world in which Homo sapiens is the only human species, is the world that was created by what our ancestors did, whether or not they intended the specific outcome. We are here, they are not, and the connection between those two facts is not coincidental. Recognizing this is not the same as condemning our ancestors for moral failings by contemporary standards. But it is the same as recognizing what happened as something that requires acknowledgement, as a loss that matters, as an ending that is part of the story of what we are and how we came to be here alone. Let us end the scientific part of this story with something concrete and immediate and personal, because the most remarkable aspect of the forgotten human species is not their strangeness, but their continuing presence, their genetic survival in the bodies of billions of living people who mostly have no idea they carry it. If you are reading or listening to this and you are of non-African ancestry, you carry Neanderthal DNA. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. In the specific biological sense of having inherited, through the ordinary mechanisms of reproduction that have linked you to your parents and your parents to theirs in an unbroken chain going back to the Pleistocene, specific DNA sequences that were last present in the Neanderthal lineage before they were transferred to the modern human lineage, through interbreeding events that happened tens of thousands of years ago. These sequences are in your genome now. They are being expressed as proteins in your cells. They are affecting the function of your immune system and your pain sensitivity and your sleep patterns and various other physiological processes in ways that modern research is still actively documenting. This is not a trivial fact. It means that the Neanderthals did not simply disappear. They became part of something else, part of the genetic makeup of the population that survived and proliferated and eventually produced every non-African person alive today. They are not entirely gone. They persist in fragmentary and diluted form, but real and functional and ongoing in the biology of their descendants. And those descendants are, among others, you. If you are of East Asian or South Asian ancestry, you likely carry a somewhat different pattern of Neanderthal ancestry than if you are of European ancestry, reflecting different patterns of interbreeding in different geographic contexts. If you are of Melanesian, Papuan, or Aboriginal Australian ancestry, you carry not only Neanderthal sequences but significant Denisovan sequences as well, possibly several % of your genome, reflecting the encounters your ancestors had with Denisovan populations as they moved through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. If you are of Tibetan ancestry, you carry specific Denisovan EPAS, one variants that are actively helping your body manage the low oxygen of the altitude you live at, a physiological gift from beings who adapted to that altitude hundreds of thousands of years before your ancestors arrived. The forgotten human species, in other words, are not entirely forgotten at all. They are remembered in the most literal and biological way possible, in the genomes of their living descendants, in the specific sequences that encode specific proteins that do specific jobs in specific bodies across the world. The meeting happened. The interbreeding happened. The children were born and they survived, and they had children of their own, and the chain of descent was maintained across all the subsequent generations until it reaches you, tonight, wherever you are, carrying in your cells a genetic inheritance from beings who lived and died tens of thousands of years before any history was written. You are the continuation of a story that includes them. The Neanderthal who made a fire in a European cave 40,000 years ago is, in a small but measurable biological sense, your ancestor. The Denisovan who climbed to altitude in the mountains of Asia is, in a small but measurable biological sense, your ancestor. The forgotten species are not separate from us. They are part of us, preserved in the fragment of their genomes that lives on in ours, doing its quiet molecular work in the darkness of your cells tonight, as you lie down and close your eyes and surrender, as all human beings have always done, to sleep. Among the most moving objects in the entire archaeological record of the Neanderthals is a small discovery from a site called La Ferracie in the Dordogne region of France, a site that has produced one of the richest assemblages of Neanderthal remains ever found. At La Ferracie, archaeologists have found the remains of multiple individuals, adults and children, buried in what appear to be deliberate graves in a limestone rock shelter. What stopped me when I first read about this site in detail was not the largest or most complete of the adult specimens. It was a description of a small skull, the skull of a Neanderthal child, estimated to have been about 2 years old at the time of death, found in a carefully dug pit, placed with a particular orientation, buried in a way that required specific effort by people who cared enough about this specific child to do something specific and deliberate for them after death. This child was a Neanderthal. Its skull shows the characteristic features of the species, the heavy brow that was beginning to develop even at this young age, the particular shape of the cranium. But it was also a child, somewhere between 1 and 3 years old enough to have been walking and perhaps beginning to talk, young enough to have still been entirely dependent on the adults around it for survival. It died, and the people around it, its parents, its community, dug a hole for it in the ground and put it in the ground and buried it, doing for it what people do for those they love when those people die. I cannot know what that felt like for the people who did it. I cannot know whether what they felt was equivalent to what a parent feels today when they lose a young child, the specific and devastating grief that does not become less devastating across all the cultural and historical distance between then and now. I cannot know whether they had a ceremony for it, whether they said anything over the small grave, whether they marked the place, whether they returned to it. The bones are all we have. But the bones are enough to know that a child died, and that the people who loved it did something about it, something that expressed the significance of the loss in the only permanent way available to them, by putting the child somewhere specific and doing something specific and deliberate with the body. This Neanderthal child matters, not as a scientific data point, not as evidence for or against a particular theory about Neanderthal burial behavior. As an individual, as a specific small person who lived for 2 years in a rock shelter in what is now France 100,000 years ago, and died and was buried by people who loved it. The species is gone. The community is gone. The specific grief of the specific people who buried this specific child is gone beyond any recovery. But the child was real. The grief was real. The love that motivated the burial was real. And the silence that has surrounded it for 100,000 years is not the silence of something that did not matter, but the silence of something that mattered to people who are no longer here to speak for it, and that deserves to be acknowledged by the people who are here and who have found it and who have the language now to say, "We see you. We know you were here. You were real, and the people who loved you were real, and what they felt when they lost you was real, and none of it is forgotten now." There is a thought experiment that I find genuinely illuminating when I try to grasp the significance of what was lost when the world of multiple human species ended. It is a thought experiment about what science might look like in a world where Neanderthals had survived alongside us. Not in some fantastic parallel universe, but in a version of history in which the processes that eliminated the Neanderthals 40,000 years ago had gone differently, in which a substantial Neanderthal population had persisted in some part of their former range, isolated enough to maintain genetic distinctiveness, numerous enough to have a viable population, and present in the world that eventually produced writing and cities, and natural history and evolutionary biology. What would it have meant for the development of biology, of anthropology, of philosophy, of ethics, to have had a genuinely distinct human species present and observable throughout the entire period of recorded human history? The questions that we are now only beginning to ask, questions about the nature of cognition and the boundaries of the human category, and the moral status of beings who are intelligent and social and tool-using, but not biologically identical to us, would have been unavoidable from the beginning. The concept of the human, which has been used as though it named a clear and natural category, would have been complicated from the start by the undeniable existence of a being that was clearly not that category, but was equally clearly not an animal in the way other animals are. The development of ethics in a world with a visible non-human intelligent species would almost certainly have been different and probably richer and more careful than the ethics we actually developed in a world where Homo sapiens is the only intelligent species visible to us. The questions that we now ask about the moral status of animals, about whether intelligence or social complexity or emotional depth confer moral consideration, would have been sharpened by the presence of an observable species that clearly had all of those things, and the answers that different philosophical and religious traditions worked out to those questions in the presence of such a species would have been tested against lived reality rather than against abstract hypotheticals. We will never know what that world would have looked like because the world that would have produced it did not come to pass. But the thought experiment illuminates, by contrast, something important about the world we actually inhabit. We have been alone in it for so long that we have stopped noticing the aloneness, stopped noticing the impoverishment of a world in which the only kind of being that is clearly intelligent and social and culturally complex is us. Every question we ask about the nature of mind and the moral circle and the boundaries of community, we ask in the absence of the data point that the other human species would have provided. We ask those questions as though the answer were obvious, as though there were clearly a sharp line between the human and the not human, when in fact the line was always blurry, and the blurriness was visible in the living world for most of the period that intelligent beings have existed on Earth. There is a dimension of the story of the forgotten human species that Western science has been slow to engage with, perhaps because it requires a kind of intellectual humility that is sometimes difficult within the framework of empirical research. And that is the possibility that indigenous traditions, oral histories, and non-Western knowledge systems might contain information about the encounters between modern humans and other human species that the scientific record cannot access. This is not a romantic or uncritical claim. It is a specific empirical question. Do any surviving cultural traditions contain reliable information about the period of coexistence? The Tibetan folklore traditions about the Yeti, the large ape-like mountain creature that has been reported in the Himalayas for centuries, are particularly interesting in this context, given what we now know about the Denisovans. The Denisovans appear to have been present in the Tibetan Plateau region and in the broader Himalayan area based on the genetic evidence and the Tibetan jawbone, and they were apparently there long enough and in sufficient numbers to leave a significant genetic mark on Tibetan people. Some researchers have speculated, with appropriate caution, that the Yeti tradition might preserve some distant echo of the Denisovan presence in the region, transmitted across the tens of thousands of years, since the Denisovans disappeared through the same kind of cultural memory transmission that has been documented for other geological and ecological events. The specific features attributed to the Yeti in traditional accounts are interesting to consider in this light. Bipedal locomotion, large body size, human-like features combined with significant differences from modern humans, presence in high mountain environments, occasional interactions with human beings described as frightening or surprising, but not necessarily hostile. These features are not inconsistent with what a large-bodied Denisovan might have looked like if the specific Denisovan population of the Himalayan region were indeed large-bodied, though we have no direct skeletal evidence for the body size of Denisovans from this region. The speculation is unprovable with current evidence, but the possibility is not ridiculous. More broadly, many indigenous traditions around the world include accounts of beings that are human-adjacent, that share the world with human communities but are not fully human, that are encountered at the edges of familiar territory, that have capabilities and characteristics that partially overlap with those of modern humans while being distinct from them in significant ways. These traditions are diverse in their specific contents and come from peoples in very different geographic regions, and the differences among them probably reflect different specific histories and different cultural elaborations of whatever original experiences or observations they encoded. But the family resemblance among them is striking enough to invite the question of whether they share a common origin in actual encounters with actual beings that were human-adjacent in fact, as well as in folklore. This is a question that neither Western science nor indigenous traditions can fully answer alone. The scientific evidence for the existence of diverse archaic human species across the period of modern human expansion is now robust enough to be taken seriously as a possible foundation for some of these traditions. The oral traditions themselves, where they have been carefully documented by researchers who approach them respectfully and analytically, contain details and structures that may provide clues about what the actual encounters were like and when they occurred. A genuinely collaborative approach, bringing together the tools of genetics and archaeology and paleontology with the knowledge embedded in indigenous traditions, might yield insights that neither approach can reach alone. There is a moment that happened somewhere in the landscape of Europe or Western Asia or Southeast Asia that no one was present to witness and that no record commemorates. The moment when the last individual of one of the other human species died. The last Neanderthal, the last Denisovan. The last individual of Homo floresiensis. The last member of whatever ghost populations left their genetic mark on modern humans before disappearing. Each of these moments happened not simultaneously, but scattered across thousands of years, each one an ending with no one to notice it. The last Neanderthal may have died alone, separated from others of their kind by the gradual shrinkage of a viable population that had been going on for centuries, or may have died as part of a small remaining group that had found refuge in some corner of their former range where modern humans had not yet arrived. We know nothing specific about this individual, and given the paucity of the fossil record for the latest Neanderthals, we may never know much. What we know is that they were the last, that when they died, the 300,000-year history of Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia came to an end, that the specific knowledge they carried and the specific way of being in the world that they embodied ended with them, and that no one who cared about that ending was there to mark it. This is the starkest form of the loss. Not the gradual statistical disappearance of a species over thousands of years, which is the form in which we usually think about extinction. The specific, individual death of the last member, after which there were no more of that kind of being anywhere in the world, ever. The last Neanderthal died not knowing they were the last, not knowing that when they closed their eyes for the final time, an entire way of being human, an entire evolutionary lineage that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years, was closing with them. Not knowing that the beings who had arrived in their territory 40,000 years earlier, beings who were different from them in important ways, but similar enough to have produced children together, would eventually be the only kind of human being left in a world that had once held both. What did the world look like on the day after the last Neanderthal died? It looked exactly the same as the day before. The sun rose and set. The animals moved through the landscape. The modern humans, who were by then the dominant population of Europe, went about their lives with no awareness that the world had just changed in a way that would not be recognized for tens of thousands of years. The ending was entirely silent. The ending was, in a sense, not noticed at all because there was no one equipped to notice it, no one who understood that a species had just ceased to exist, no one who had the conceptual framework to recognize the significance of what had just happened. We are the ones who notice it, 40,000 years later, armed with fossil records and ancient DNA and the tools of modern science, looking back at an ending that happened in silence and trying to understand what it meant. The noticing is late. It is incomplete. The understanding is partial and will always be partial, because too much is gone to fully recover. But the noticing matters. The acknowledgement matters. The recognition that those beings were real and that their ending was a loss, and that the world we inhabit is impoverished by their absence, however much it has been enriched by the continuation of some of their genes in our own lineage, matters. They deserve that recognition, however inadequate, however impossibly belated. The silence was long enough. It is time to speak their names, even if the only names we have for them are technical labels given by scientists who found their bones, rather than the names they gave each other, names spoken in languages we will never hear. Sleep well. The world was once richer with their presence. The world still carries traces of them. And the recognition of that truth, however partial and however late, is the least we owe them. After all of this, after the genetics and the fossils and the archaeological reconstructions and the philosophical reflections and the ethical reckonings, there is a question that remains, one that I think is the most important and the most unanswerable of them all, and that is the question with which we began this conversation. Were we ever alone? And the answer that has emerged across the course of this story is complex. We were not alone in the world while the other human species were alive. But we have been alone for 40,000 years, a span of time that is long by human standards and short by evolutionary ones. We are alone now, in the sense that no other species shares the human niche with us. And we have been alone long enough that the aloneness feels natural and permanent, as though it were the intended state of the world, rather than a historical accident produced by specific events in specific circumstances. But the genetic evidence has qualified even that aloneness. We carry the others within us. Not their culture, not their knowledge, not their languages or their stories or their specific ways of seeing the world. Those are gone. But the biological residue of their existence persists in our cells, doing real work, affecting real characteristics, connecting us in a real and measurable way to lineages that separated from ours hundreds of thousands of years ago, and that rejoined it through the specific, intimate encounters that the genetics records. We are the survivors, but we are not the sole representatives of all that ever existed in the human lineage. We are the inheritors, in a biological sense, of something larger and stranger and more diverse than the single lineage that the standard human story describes. The recognition of this truth changes something, or should change something, about how we understand ourselves. We are not the end point of a single trajectory, not the culmination of a directional process that was always moving toward us. We are the survivors of a more complex history, shaped by encounters and mergers and extinctions and the specific contingencies of specific moments in a world that once held more than one answer to the question of what a human being could be. The other human species are gone, but they are part of our story, part of what produced us, part of the long and complicated process that eventually generated the kind of being that can ask questions about its own history and try to find the answers in the rocks and the bones and the ancient DNA. They were here, they mattered, and the world they inhabited, the world with more than one kind of human being walking through it, was in some ways a richer world than the one we have inherited. Acknowledging that does not diminish us, it deepens us. It extends the story back further into the past where it belongs, and it connects us to beings who are gone, but not entirely gone, forgotten, but not entirely forgotten, lost, but not entirely lost, because the cells of their distant descendants are sleeping in the darkness of their own nights across the world, carrying forward in the most literal and biological way possible the trace of all those hundreds of thousands of years of being human in more ways than one. Sleep well. Tomorrow you will wake up in a world that had more in it than you knew. And knowing that, really knowing it, makes the world you wake up in larger than it was before you closed your eyes tonight. The findings described throughout this script represent the current state of research in paleoanthropology, ancient genomics, and Pleistocene archaeology. The field is rapidly evolving, and specific details, dates, population sizes, the interpretation of specific behavioral evidence are subjects of ongoing scientific debate. What is not in serious scientific dispute is the core finding that multiple distinct human species or populations shared the Earth during the period of modern human origins and expansion, that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and that the genetic legacy of those encounters persists in living human populations. These are among the most robustly established findings in the entire history of the life sciences, and their implications for our understanding of human origins, human diversity, and the nature of the human category are profound and continuing to be worked out. The individuals who made these discoveries and whose work underlies everything in this script include Svante Pääbo and the team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, whose ancient DNA work earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022. The researchers who discovered and described Homo floresiensis, including Mike Morwood, Peter Brown, and their colleagues. The team led by Florent Détroit, who described Homo luzonensis, and the many researchers who have worked for decades to build the fossil and archaeological record of Neanderthal behavior and culture. Their work has transformed our understanding of who we are and where we came from, and this story is an attempt to make that transformation visible to the widest possible audience. The world that modern science has revealed, a world in which human diversity once ran far deeper than anything visible in our current single-species existence, is one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the modern era. It deserves to be known. It deserves to be felt. And on nights like this one, when the darkness is quiet and the mind is open and the past seems both very far away and very close, it deserves to be held with the reverence and the wonder that the forgotten species, the beings who were fully human in all the ways that matter, and who are now entirely gone except for the traces they left in us, genuinely deserve. Sleep well. The forgotten are not entirely forgotten. They sleep in your cells. And if you found yourself moved by any of this tonight, by the Neanderthal child buried in the Dordogne, by the Denisovan whose genes now protect Tibetan lungs at altitude, by the tiny people of Flores who hunted dwarf elephants with stone tools and brains a third the size of yours, by the simple fact that you carry in your cells the biological legacy of beings who have been gone for 40,000 years, then please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. There are more chapters of this strange and beautiful and terrible and redemptive story of what it has meant to be human across the full sweep of time that the word human covers. And they deserve to be told in the dark, in a quiet voice, to people lying down with open minds and the willingness to let the world be larger and stranger and more full of lost things than they had known before. Subscribe and sleep well, wherever you are tonight, knowing that you come from further and stranger places than you knew.